Dear students, in this module we will discuss and gain knowledge about the non-probability sampling methods and the sample size determination. The learning objectives concerned to this module are non-probability sampling methods, their meaning and importance, types of non-probability sampling methods like purposive sampling, convenience sampling, quota sampling and snowball sampling, advantages and disadvantages of these sampling methods, and finally we will discuss about sample size determination, its importance and procedures. First and foremost one, we will see what do you mean by non-probability sampling. In the earlier module we have discussed about probability sampling methods. Here non-probability sampling represents a group of sampling techniques that will help researchers to select the sample units from a population that they are interested in studying. The basic characteristic of non-probability sampling techniques is that samples are selected based on the subjective judgment of the researcher rather than random selection as discussed in the earlier module. Then one may get the impression that non-probability sampling techniques are inferior to probability sampling techniques and thereby not reliable in the selection of sample. But it is not so, because in social science research there are many circumstances, especially in the case of qualitative research, wherein probability sampling is not feasible and practical. In such situations, the non-probability sampling techniques, also known as non-random sampling techniques, are more suitable and applicable. Generally, non-probability sampling designs are used when either the number of elements in a population is unknown or the elements cannot be individually identified. In other words, in the absence of a sampling frame. In such situations, the selection of sample elements is dependent upon other considerations such as mostly subjective judgments and oriented to the research topic. By and large, these techniques are used in qualitative research and at times even in quantitative research also. In these techniques, the choice of selection of units, that is the cases to be included in the sample, is mostly based on the theoretical reasons rather than following probability theory. In these techniques, researchers tend to be interested in the intricacies of the sample being studied, but lesser importance is given to the process of arriving at some generalizations. Those who deal with small samples only deal with these type of sampling designs. In some situations or topics of research, for example, studying HIV/AIDS affected, MSM, prostitutes, drug addicts, etc., where a list of the population do not exist, non-probability sampling provides a viable alternative that can be used. Moreover, these research designs would be much more useful in exploratory research, where the aim is to find out if a problem or issue even exists in a quick and inexpensive way. These designs are also helpful to find out whether a problem or issue is worth examining in more depth and ethically viable. Now, we will see what are the major non-probability sampling techniques. There are four non-probability techniques are there, which are listed here: purposive sampling and judgment or judgment sampling, convenient sampling or accidental sampling, quota sampling and snowball sampling. We will discuss briefly about each one of these. Firstly, the purposive sampling or judgment sampling. Purposive sampling, the researcher would select the sample with a purpose in mind. This is known as judgment sampling because the researcher believes that some subjects are more suitable for the research, that is someone's personal judgment, compared to other individuals. This is the reason why they are purposefully chosen as a sample, for example, people, cases or organizations, etc., for this study. Usually, the sample will be small and typical in nature, in which one is interested to study. The sample will be judged based on the needs of the researcher. From these samples, the researchers would try to get the best information to achieve the objectives of their research studies. However, the researchers would try to match their samples to the respective universe or population along some of the important known characteristics. The researchers will approach the people or organizations that they are likely to have, in their opinion, the required information and be willing to share it with them. The sample will be selected from one or more specific predetermined groups that are suitable for researchers' objectives. For example, most socioeconomic surveys and market research surveys, studies on social problems like domestic violence, prostitution, premarital sex, etc., problems of elderly living in old age homes, caregiving to elderly persons, etc., are all examples where purposive sampling would be used. The advantages of purposive sampling are: it is less costly and more convenient, it guarantees inclusion of relevant elements in the sample, one can reach the targeted sample quickly, to a certain extent generalizations can be made for the population studied. Disadvantages side: does not ensure representativeness of the sample. This method requires more prior information about the population one studies, otherwise difficult to decide the suitability of the sample. Biases from the researcher's end are likely to crop up. The second type of non-probability sampling technique is convenience sampling or accidental sampling. Convenience sampling, also known as accidental sampling, means selecting sample units on the basis of easy approaches that are convenient to the researchers. The easy approaches may be guided by easy accessing or geographical proximity or known contacts and ready approval for understanding the study or for being part of the sample. It is otherwise interviewing a sample of people whom the researcher happened to meet or researchers happen to meet accidentally. It is mostly used for sample purposes such as testing ideas or gaining ideas or a rough impression about the subjects of interest. With a slight differentiation, accidental sampling is primarily selecting a place where the researcher is likely to find potential respondents, which place may or may not be most convenient to the researcher. Generally, the researchers collect information from a specified number of respondents whom he or she is able to contact, or until the researcher has reached the saturation point or the point at which satisfied with the sample size. For example, studies on political participation, voting behavior, dowry, quality of services in government healthcare system, domestic violence, etc., are some examples of studies where convenience sampling would be useful. Advantages of convenience sampling wise: it is the cheapest and simplest and easy to do, saves time and money, one can collect useful data and information that might not possible to collect based on probability sampling techniques. It does not require a list of population and it does not require any statistical experience also. Disadvantages side: it is highly biased because of researchers' subjectivity and therefore it does not yield a representative sample. It is the less reliable sampling method. The findings cannot be generalized. It suffers from a number of biases. The third type of non-probability sampling method is quota sampling. Quota sampling means selecting the sample from each category wherein the researcher ensures an equal or proportionate representation of subjects or persons on which trait is considered as the basis of quota. For example, in studying people's living conditions, opinions, attitudes, etc., the relevant basis of stratification usually used is age, gender, sex, education, place of residence, income, socioeconomic status, caste, and so on. The required number of elements from each category is determined by the researcher as per certain criteria, ahead of time according to the number of elements in each category. It appears similar to stratified sampling, except that the sample units will not be selected on the basis of probability sampling technique. The quota can also be fixed upon proportionately or disproportionately to represent the major characteristics of the population by sampling a proportional amount of each. Quota sampling is usually carried out in 3 stages. Firstly, the population to be studied has to be classified in terms of properties known or assumed to be pertinent characteristics being studied. Instead, the researcher will decide according to individual choice or judgment, but from different strata, that is groups. Secondly, the proportion of population falling into each group or class is determined on the basis of the known, assumed or estimated composition of the population, and at the third stage deciding the quota to be fixed in each of the stratum based on the proportion mentioned step 2. It is mostly used in marketing and public opinion surveys. Advantages wise, if it is properly planned and executed, a quota sample is most likely to give maximum representative sample of the population. It is less costly and less time consuming, quicker and easier because there is no need for a list of population, that is sample frame. It allows more easy comparison of the findings between samples of the groups, that is strata, under consideration. Disadvantages side, it may not yield a precisely representative sample and therefore sampling errors would be more and difficult to determine the sampling error also. Thirdly, sampling bias is likely to occur and thereby it is not possible to make statistical inferences from the sample population. At times, for generalizations of the findings, the researcher is likely to increase the sample size from each quota or cover more quotas, that is more groups, that is strata, and thereby the cost and time to carry out the research increases. The next type of non-probability sampling is snowball sampling. In snowball sampling, the researcher will begin by identifying someone who meets the criteria for inclusion in the study. Then the researcher will ask them to recommend others who they may know who also meet the criteria. Although this method would hardly lead to representative samples, there are times when it may be the best method available. Snowball sampling is especially useful when you are trying to reach populations that are inaccessible or hard to find and reach. Thus, this sample enables building up a list or sample of special population by using an initial set of its members as informants. The researcher will ask each one of the respondents to supply names of others who have similar problems and continue this process until she gets an exhaustive list from which to draw a sample or make a census survey. For example, mostly this type of sampling technique is used in sociometric studies, studies related to the homeless, stigmatized and marginalized populations like those with HIV/AIDS, MSM, prostitutes, drug users, etc., persons who have cleft lips, other special categories of persons like IVF mothers, surrogate mothers, etc. Advantages of snowball sampling are: it is useful to study populations with special or rare problems. It is useful to study smaller populations to which no sample frames are readily available. It is useful for studying communication patterns, decision making or diffusion of knowledge within a group. And disadvantages side, it does not allow the use of statistical methods of probability. It is difficult to apply when the population is large, and it does not ensure inclusion of all elements in the list. Similarly, sampling biases are likely to occur and thereby statistical inferences and generalizations are not reliable. And finally, difficult to use when one interested to collect fairly large samples. Now, having learned about the sampling methods, now we will focus upon the determination of sample size, its need and importance. In recent times, there is an ever increasing need for representative statistical samples in empirical research, which has created the demand for an effective method of determining sample size. But this has become somewhat difficult to social science researchers who mostly lack statistical and or mathematical knowledge and application to social sciences. Basically, the sample size depends on what the researcher wants to do with the findings and what type of relationships he wants to establish, besides the level of accuracy required in the results. It also differs depending on the research design. For instance, survey research design requires large sample size to represent the target population. In experimental research designs with the treatment and control groups, the sample sizes will be generally less, and at times the size may differ in each group also. Some of the basic factors to be considered while determining the sample size are the nature of the population, complexity of tabulation, problems related to the collection of data and type of sampling. We will discuss briefly about each of these. Firstly, the nature of the population. If the population to be studied is more homogeneous in nature, fewer cases will yield reliable results. On the other hand, if the population is largely heterogeneous in nature, more number of cases may be required representing different groups so as to constitute a reliable sample size. Secondly, complexity of tabulation also taken into consideration while determining the size of the sample. The size of the sample also depends upon the number of categories and classes into which the findings are to be grouped and analyzed. If such categories are large in number, the sample size also would be large enough to yield reliable statistical results. Thirdly, problems related to the collection of data. Generally, data collection to cover the large samples size need lot of funds, time and administrative capabilities. Moreover, one has to think over the type of information to be collected, the length of data collection tool, that is questionnaire or interview schedule, and number of field workers to be engaged in, the refuse rate, the type of sampling method employed, method of data collection, etc. The researcher should keep in mind all these factors before deciding the size of the sample. Fourthly, the type of sampling also makes a point while determining the size of the sample. If the population is homogeneous, generally smaller size of sample are sufficient, whatever be the sampling plan. On the other hand, in the case of large populations, if stratification is employed, smaller sample sizes are sufficient. This is because if the population is more heterogeneous, the greater will be the possible economic of cases through stratification. Thus, the stratified sampling techniques requires only fewer cases compared to simple random sampling. Now, we will see some of the mathematical formulae to determine the sample size. In the recent past, if the researcher wants to collect reliable information from large size of populations, the sample size is determined scientifically through simple mathematical formulae with certain requirements, like confidence of interval, level of accuracy or confidence level, etc. Though several types of such a formulae have been developed by the researchers, the sample size formulas are two types. One is for unknown population. Here, the following sample size formulae for infinite population, that is more than 50,000, is used to arrive at a representative number of respondents when population estimation is known. This is developed by Gordon. Here, n equals to z square into p into 1 minus p divided by m square, where n is the sample size for infinite population, z is the z value. For example, it may be 1.95 for 95% or confidence interval. P is the population proportion expressed as decimal assumed to be 0.5 or 50%, and m is the margin of error at 5%, that is 0.5%. Similarly, another formula have been developed for known population for selecting the sample size. If the target population is finite, that is 50,000 or less, the following formula developed by Krejcik and Morgan may be used for determining the sample size. Here the sample size S equals to z square into n into p 1 minus p divided by d square into n minus 1 plus z square into p into 1 minus p, where S is equal to required sample size, z is equal to z value 1.95 for 95% confidence interval, p is the population proportion expressed as a decimal assumed to be 0.5 or 50%, n equals to population size, d equals to degrees of accuracy, and normally we will kept at 5% level, expressed as a proportion 0.05, which is called which is also known as margin of error. In fact, one can get the ready-made sample determination tables prepared by different mathematicians and statisticians, including that of Krejcik and Morgan, from internet or web sources. Researchers in the recent past are mostly making use of these tables so as to determine the appropriate size of sample for research studies undertaken by them. In sum, in this module, we have discussed and learnt about the various aspects related to non-probability sampling methods such as purposive sampling, convenience sampling, quota sampling and snowball sampling, with their importance, sample selection, procedures and advantages and disadvantages. Further, you have also learnt about the sample size determination. Hope understanding all these would be helpful to you in choosing suitable non-probability techniques as well as in determining the appropriate sample size for your research studies. Thank you.